Ja, Jeanette, je kan.
Welcome everybody this afternoon at Nut, a theatre company based in Utrecht, the Netherlands. My name is Jeanette van Lange. I'm the business manager and dramaturg of the company, and I will host this afternoon. The occasion we're hosting this conversation is our performance, The Chaos of 2020, which we will be performing this fall in whatever shape or form. We'll have to see what the announcement of the new corona measures coming Tuesday will bring us. We could have never thought that the title of our performance would be so applicable to this year we're in. We situated this play around the presidential elections in the United States, which we assume to still take place on November 3rd. In preparation of this performance, we like to share with you, our audience, some of the thinking and talking we do about the important issues and subjects and themes the play is about. Because the elections are merely a background to which we discuss things such as identity politics, inequality, and racism. And this afternoon will be a conversation between Chaos actress Yuta Wong-Loy-Sing and professor of history at the University of Alabama, Hillary Green. Hillary is specialized in African American history and Civil War history. Yuta is a Dutch actress who works in both the Netherlands and the US. In the Netherlands, she's mostly known for her parts in film and television productions. Hillary and Yuta will speak about the Black Lives Matter movement. What can we learn about this movement if we put it into a historical and theoretical framework? And when we do so, can we make sure the movement causes a lasting impact instead of being a hype? And if we want this to happen, what are good and effective ways to have conversations about racism? Anyone with questions can leave theirs in the comments on Instagram or YouTube at the end of the conversation around 5 o'clock. We'll make sure that there's some time to answer some of your questions. I will make a selection and try my best to do that in a good way. So welcome Hillary and welcome Yuta.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you both, and I'm looking forward to the coming hour.
Same. Hi, Hillary. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
How have you been?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Because the last time we talked to you, you were one of our interviewees that we spoke to. You were busy refurnishing or like moving into your apartment. How's it been going?
Oh, it's pretty good. You can see my office behind me that I'm settled in, and I can actually not have moving boxes near me. So.
I love it. I love it. I'm so happy for you. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you again because, as you know, we spoke to a lot of people, different states in America. You were, I think, which state did you represent?
I believe it was either, I'm not sure if it was Alabama or North Carolina because I just moved over.
Exactly. So to me, like you pop up in my mind, whether it's North Carolina or Alabama. I wasn't sure which one it was. But at this point, it doesn't really matter. But I think the most important thing was that our conversation really stuck with me because of all of the profound things you said. So like, obviously, when we talk about what's happening right now in the States, but also globally, I think one of the statements you made was summer of 2020 is going to be looked at as the summer of 68. Do you remember saying that?
Yes, I do. And I still believe that just that election cycle was very chaotic. Health-wise, there were different flus that were going on, but more importantly, it was at the end of what people see as the civil rights movement and shift into more radicalism, but that was always there. And right now, I think it's analogous to where we kind of are now with Black Lives Matter as this longer movement that has been there for a while, but it's this election cycle, America, the continued murder of African Americans, like with the Black Power movement, they were focused on policing, different things like that. But the one caveat I really see is unique is all of this is occurring amid a backdrop of global white supremacy and a pandemic. and that it's Black Lives Matter, but we also have white extremists who I will call terrorists, because that's what they are, threatening to kill people just because of the skin color, what they perceive as liberal. They have not talked to people. This is all in their mind. And this threat that they see, and I see that with the summer of '68, and when the way of Black power is being described, and King, who was called socialist, and the same language, same words are being thrown about now, except now instead of the civil rights movement, the so-called Black leaders of King and other, it's now Black Lives Matter. And so 68, 2020.
It's just, you feel it's exactly the same. But okay, so in just a matter of, I don't know if it was a minute or 2 minutes, you just said so many things that I want to dive right into. And I don't know if I should like hold a little notepad, but we're just gonna be all over the place. And,
that's okay.
You know, I'm Black, as you may have noticed, but there's so many things that historically that I'm actually unaware of, based on the fact that I'm here. I'm in the Netherlands. So like, even though I work in the States, or I have been working in the States a lot, I feel like I'm getting to know history, or Black African-American history from a whole different perspective. Because obviously the things that we have learned in our history books, even when it comes to our own history, like I'm from Suriname originally, you know, so that's like, there's a whole different dynamic going on. But at the same time, it's the same, you know, large transatlantic slave trade, which led Black people to different parts of the world. But that's something I want to get into later, like the whole diaspora thing.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so because we have time, right? We have time. We have time. But you said something that I found very interesting. You said, you mentioned the word radicalism. It's like there's a whole movement of Black people in America that feel like they have to fight for equality, but at some point I feel like it switches to something else, and it's being called radicalism. And calling it radicalism gives it such a negative connotation, and almost like deflects, you know, the attention from what the marching is all about.
Yeah, but this is one of the things where I see where race matters. You always have conservative thought, moderate thought, and radical. You have the extremes within African-American intellectual history, African-American protest movements from abolition to the present. But one of the things I find that's interesting, this is the same with white and people in dominant power too, but it's this presumption that African Americans don't have this spectrum of thoughts around the same frame and understanding of equality, citizenship, but more importantly, treating one another with humanity and respect. That you don't have these conservative viewpoints or intergenerational ideas. So for me, when I say more radical perspectives, I always get labeled on the youth, and the youth who are just upset with the old elders. Sadly, I'm an elder now at 43. I know, but with my students, they see me as, okay, you're old. I'm like, okay. But at the same time, that long view and seeing that has always been this movement. But one of the things I find that's telling is that the stereotypes are going baseline Black youth, but again, it goes against the humanity of these people because they're other. They are radical Black leftists. They are radical socialists. They are, in that language was 68. The civil rights movement was seen as anti-American because they were questioning Jim Crow in the Cold War era. Just to say, I demand respect in the viewpoint of those pundits who are trying to maintain power is radical.
It's radical, yeah.
It doesn't matter. Just speaking up to say this is not working is seen as radical. Whereas when you look at it, there's a spectrum within that. So for me, I always look at that spectrum, but also how it's perceived. But the baseline perception, I'm radical, even though my students think I'm an old adult who doesn't do anything. Yeah. And I just teach it. And as an educator, I am seen as radical because I teach Black history.
Exactly.
I'm not in the streets. I'm not doing anything. I'm just teaching, but therefore I'm on the same brush as radical as those in the streets with signs, no guns. It is the most, I'm thinking of Malcolm X, the most non-radical movement ever, because people are going peacefully, non-violence, but yet we are all radical on this spectrum in this election moment.
That's very interesting, because I feel quite radical as well. But then again, I question myself, like, to what extent are you, can I call myself radical? I don't know how to shoot a gun. I don't know how to, like,
neither.
What is radical, but just expressing how you feel and how you see change. And especially if that's an opinion that goes against the status quo, that means it's radical at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I've come to learn, whether I grew up in the late 70s, I was born in 1977, so I saw the affirmative action debates of the Reagan as a kid, and to now, just being a Black woman walking in some sectors, people already identified me before they even know who I am, know what my thoughts are. And that's one of the things when I go back to 68 and seeing that summer like that, that's the state of America we are, with this lack of reconciliation over race that still goes back to slavery. So for me, I can take the long view. I could see Black Lives Matter within the Black political thought and the spectrum within there, where you have people who are using all talents, but we're all fighting for the same thing: democracy and the American ideals in a nation that does not see me as a human or respect my identity, because at one point in our history from the beginning, I was seen as property, never a person. And I think that lack of reconciliation with the race baiting, fear mongering, that also has been a response to Black activism and African Americans and their allies. And there's always been a coalition of allies of the African Americans. It's not just a Black thing, it's a Black mobilized and political tradition, that it's easy to demonize me rather than to question the structures that allow for this continued demonization.
That's so interesting, because I feel like a lot of people who see the Black Lives Matter movement are so much more worried about the radicalism that it brings, the alleged looting and the rioting and the fact that everyone is risking public health care and safety because they're going out on the streets when there's a pandemic going on. But do you think it's a lack of historical context? You were talking about the whole political spectrum and getting where it comes from.
I think it's willful ignorance and the privilege to ignore, because the history's always been there.
Willful ignorance and the privilege to ignore. Let's can we dive into that part?
Yes, it's
willful ignorance, because I've been trying to figure out what happens in someone's brain when you see Black people and white people, all colors, going out on the street, and the only thing you can wonder is, are they scared of COVID-19? So in my mind, I would be like, of course people are scared, but wouldn't that just say something about the urgency of the matter instead of, So I feel like the willful ignorance.
Yeah.
Is that what it is? Is that it?
Oh, no, I see it, because one of the things I have seen is the rhetoric of history that white armed men with AR-15s can go into a state capitol, go into Charlottesville to protect a fabricated myth of what the Confederacy was, for instance, or this fabricated myth that this governor of Michigan has to reopen. They are good people trying to help one another, using the language of militia as if they are going back to the American Revolution. And it's striking to see armed AR-15 men who are all white women screaming in, but African-American protesters, white individuals, and the diversity of those crowds, unarmed.
Peaceful protesting.
Non-violence. No one has guns. It's striking. They're looters, they're criminals, they're radicals. They need to be tear gassed. They need to be put down. And when militias are brought in, not the National Guard, not the normal structures within our country to police domestic events. And I think about the military where it's like domestic and foreign enemies. These are unarmed Americans just asking for the right to live and uphold their constitutional rights. They get tear gas. And militias who are going against this, terrorizing community, co-opted language, are shooting unarmed, nonviolent individuals. And also too, starting the idea of looting so that it automatically deflects on them where they're the instigators. But this is people who don't want to have a conversation, who are not willing to talk to why people are on the ground, but also to ignore the historic and systemic reasons why they're out there. And they choose that. That's a choice. Because all they had to do is, instead of coming in armed, is let's have a conversation and talk about why you're out here. Mm-hmm. So that willful ignorance and to proceed rather than to go off and figure out why the movement's happening, why people are out there. It's a choice. Mm. And that choice is condoned as good people, but those who have been struggling and thinking about this amid a pandemic has been fascinating. The other thing I found that's fascinating about this in the pandemic, we're not seeing outbreaks coming from peaceful, nonviolent protesters because they're all masked. They're all masked. They're all there. They're social distancing. So it's the good people who are getting sick, the good people who are flouting the rules and the law because they have sanction, and the willingness to ignore history, the privilege to ignore plight of marginalized people and the demonization of people. That is why I really see willful ignorance, because at any time education is something I always see as a way to, as a part of the solution, not the final thing, but we have to re-educate people just to see the humanity of people. And if you can't do that, that's where the history part comes in, and to say that, so when I hear all lives matter, I'm like, when in US history has all lives matter? Point to me a time where that actually happened. Ooh. And they can't, because I'm like, it never existed. So let's, instead of saying that,
oh my gosh. I feel like this is gonna be, we're gonna make it a 4-hour conversation. I'm just gonna put it out there. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm just okay. So first of all, like it's a choice to be misinformed or uninformed.
Yeah.
There's education, but then again, I feel like the propaganda of all of these countries is also, they're also in on it. Because otherwise, people would learn these things in school. Like when I look at the Netherlands, and when I look at my own history books that I have had to study, I just feel like they purposefully let it, they try to like omit things from history.
Oh, yeah.
So that now that people are out on the streets, there's no historical context to begin with. So it has to be, where should it come from? Like if you're just a very, very tangible example, like if you're white and you're confused and you're like, no, wait a minute, not just Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. And this is someone with good intentions. They are like, well, I really do feel like everyone deserves a better life, or a life to begin with. But someone with those good intentions, with that, frame of thought, it's like they come from a whole different place, because they don't have the skills or the tools or the knowledge to begin with. How do you?
This is where all they have to say is, I don't know. That is also a choice. Admit that you don't know. And for something that I find that's interesting with education, because that has been political, and that's part of that post-Civil War miseducation. And it also expands this exceptionalism that each nation has its best. So what you do is you whitewash all the violence, you erase everything unless it puts the nation first in a good light. But those documents, even the Constitution, people don't read the Constitution. They don't know what those amendments are. They can't even see the congruence of even why there's a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in there, because they never read the document beyond what the first 10 pieces and what they got in school and what was called civics.
Oh, wait a minute. I didn't know that. So in school, you only learn, because obviously I haven't been to elementary or high school, any education in the States whatsoever. But are you saying that?
It's across the board. People don't learn even state governments. And one of the things I find fascinating is the discussion over the current moment. And people are like, I didn't know there was a 25th Amendment. I'm like, have you not read the founding document? And its changes over time. Also, the Supreme Court and the debates over that. And I'm like, and people are talking about earlier moments that led to Jim Crow. And I'm like, and they're pointing out cases and people don't know. And I'm like, this is American history. This is the US Supreme Court decisions that you should have read. But my thing is, what I've learned is that states and school boards are some of the most powerful positions ever, because I keep on thinking about Frederick Douglass and other enslaved people who had to steal an education because there was laws against them from learning, and that knowledge is power. And one of the things that Black Lives Matter movement has done has made accessible, publicly available documents to counter the misinformation that started from K through 12. The self-selection at college, because at college you can choose your classes. How many students I've had who refuse to take a history course because they're like, I don't want to memorize things. So they're self-selecting their topics. And this is where those choices come in. And one of the things that has been helpful for me in this moment is I've been hearing more from people, not in my classes, asking, I don't know this history. Can you recommend a book? Can you recommend sites? And I get to point them out oftentimes to the Library of Congress. I'm like, this is all digitized. Let's go through, pick a year, read a newspaper from this time. Look at this. Here's these short pieces and essays. Here are books. Don't read this book, but read these books.
Yeah.
But it all starts with, I realize now all lives don't matter in this country, but we can make it better. And this is that flexibility of the American ideal, that even from the beginning, a more perfect union. There's always room for growth just with that phrase alone. How do you make it a more perfect union? And some of that is to realize, one, you don't know.
You don't
have to ask, and willing to listen and have empathy. You'll have that. And so for me, one of the scary things about this with 68 is that unreconciled past around race. And it's easy just to say, oh, you're all Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, how do you know Black Lives Matter? That is the question. But it goes back to that choice, the willfulness to ignore. And that's why I say willful ignorance, because the stuff's there. And also the privilege to ignore the plight of others. And this pandemic has exposed all of that in very concrete ways. And for me, it's why this moment, this summer, is going to be talked about, written about like 68 was. And it's a global movement. It's global.
Really global, because yeah, I mean, we've been seeing this movement starting a few years back. I mean, my mom came here when she was 7. I think that was in like 65 or something. And one of the first stories she told me and that she is able to remember is that someone called her blackface. So we have this mythical character, pretty sure you heard about it. He's called Black Pete. And it's like Santa Claus's cousin. This is going to be a short summary of what this children's tradition is, because it's a children's tradition. It's a party. It's like, you know, the Dutch hold it very high in their culture. So it's like something that they celebrate every year, December 5th. And he comes in on a boat. It's the Santa Claus's cousin. He's called Sinterklaas. I just call him his cousin. He's not his cousin. But he kind of looks like that, like white beard, you know, red Pope-like dress. And he has his little helpers with him. And they're like, you know, blackface. They have like a little fro wig. Their faces are painted black, red lips, these type of earrings, and they just jump around like they're crazy. And it's supposed to be fun, but they always, in all the songs, it's a threat. Like, if you're not, you haven't been a good kid, Black Pete is gonna take you with him. His bag that's filled with candy, presents, but when he goes back, he takes home all the bad kids. So, I mean, that connotation in itself is like, okay, we're not going to get into that because I'm pretty sure we don't need to have that discussion, but it's a huge debate in the Netherlands whether that mythical figure should be abolished or not.
And I think all of those conversations need to be happening, because just because it's tradition for whom? Whose values? Does that mean if it's wrong, do you have to perpetuate and continue it? What was the focus? And I think that's the key. And we're questioning everything now. And we should have been questioned some of these traditions.
Yeah, but I do feel like the amount of resistance that just starts like stirring up to the surface is like, it's really baffling to me, because the debate has been going on for years in the Netherlands, and now it just topped up with the Black Lives Matter movement, and it topped up with the pandemic, and it topped up with all these things. It's like we're having this moment where all of a sudden, you know, everything comes together. But what is that resistance besides the willful ignorance? Is it fear?
Oh, no, it's not fear. Because one of the things I realized with the Confederate monuments and everything since the Dylan Roof massacred 9 people at Bible study in Charleston, this is where that willfulness to ignore people come in, and that privilege to ignore. Because I have people who don't even know where these monuments are, but yet they'll defend them. Like, do you know where your monument is? Do you know the context where it came up? They have no clue, but it is the threat of removal of that power structure of whiteness, and to remind African Americans, especially in the South, of their place, the geographies of where they can go. That's the fear. And you started to see this, I think, in the United States, but also globally, with the rise of the majority minority, and started using that language in around the late 90s, early 2000s, that white Americans are going to be the new minority, and this fear of loss of power. And it's all about power. And so for me, we can't remove this. I'm like, but you don't know where it is. Or we can't talk about the experiences of enslaved people or the history of African Americans who always rejected those monuments because they don't matter. Their viewpoints don't matter. My matter, my identity matters. And this is a fear of loss, but at a loss, I think, is continuation of, again, Black political thought and political struggles, because when we go back to the end of slavery and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and this violence, it was a loss of an underclass of people considered as property who are now citizens. And like, oh, wait, how am I going to justify my existence here because there's no one below me? During the civil rights movement, that fear of the White Citizen Council, the rise of the third Ku Klux Klan in the United States, and these violence and mob violence and the policing, we got to control this group of people who just want to be treated as citizens, to now that, again, openness to hire armed police and militias. And this is definitely in '68 in the civil rights movement in a place like Alabama, especially Tuscaloosa, where my school is. The city police frequently hired Klansmen to go in to put down any peaceful protests in their community. So when I see the pictures like in Minneapolis and I see the police with armed militia, people like my dad, who grew up during the civil rights movement, he just turned 70. He's like, that's what they did when I was a kid. This is the same thing. So those images are there. And the ones who know it are the ones who have been in the struggle and seeing the impact that has affected. And the ones I find that's telling now that the group of people, they're so diverse. In Davidson, North Carolina, where I'm at, I have seen more Black Lives Matter signs on multi-million-dollar homes and other things. I'm like, okay, there's my allies. I can work with them. We can
on the same page.
Well, they're almost on the same page. They need some education, but I can work with them now.
Okay, so versus receptive for, they're willing. They're willing.
Yeah, exactly.
That starts, right?
It goes back to they didn't know. They're willing to see and finally get out of the privilege to ignore and actually see. See the country, see the myths, that what they are myths, because that never happened. Like the past that's mythicized and romanticized never existed at all. And so, but now they see hurt, they see pain, they actually see their neighbors, they see their communities, and they're listening, but because they have no longer that privilege to ignore. And that is one of those things between the ignorance of who don't want to listen, don't care, nothing you could do to change them over traditions, and what was always the role of white privilege in the United States and the globe, to now, wait a minute, this is wrong. Maybe we should be doing something about this because we are neighbors, we are citizens, we are equal, we are humans. And you have the right to go out of your house without being shot. You should have the right to go. Sadly, I was in Virginia 2 weeks ago, and I just went to a restaurant where there was a political rally for the current administration. And within 2 minutes, I was called the N-word. And I just had my collared sweatshirt on and everything. And so for me,
what exactly happened? You said you went to a restaurant. There was
just to go pick. It was close to a rally, and I was just picking up dinner. And I'm like, this people question my place in there. And I said, for me, usually I can ignore it, but I'm like, you know what? My money spends elsewhere. I'm just gonna go. And I just went up to the manager and filed a complaint, and I left.
So, but who called you then?
It was the customers at the restaurant. And I'm like, if they feel comfortable that they can do this for a person just picking up their food. And I really had my collared sweatshirt on. So I had my pink Franklin Marshall hoodie on. And I was just like coming in, picking up food.
So is there, how do you, I'm pretty sure we can, the way you responded was so mature and, you kept calm and collected. How do you feel about people who are not?
I understand. Like, I totally understand, because if I was my younger self, there would be different.
So what happened between the younger self and the older self? Because I'm the younger self right now.
I became this older self and realizing that how I respond will disarm faster if I don't go into the stereotype that's expected of me. And I learned this like as an early teenager. As I used to tell people, I used to curse. I still curse on once in a while, but I used to all the time. That I realized it wasn't going anywhere. So I just started responding with kindness and going back in and just like, oh, okay, so bless your heart, I'll pray for you today. And then go on my merry way. In my mind, totally different. But I've learned to control, because one of the things I realize is people are expecting something different of me. And they're expecting a visceral response to justify their bad behavior. It has nothing to do with, wait a minute, why are you calling me this? Like, I have no idea who you are. Who are you to do this? So instead, I respond back with like, and this is where I've seen with the civil rights movement and nonviolence, and even that control of when do you speak, when not to, how do you control face. So for me, I went up to the manager and it's like, you're not getting my money. You have some customers over here. But I walked up head high out the door, and that's not what they expected. They expected me to be angry Black woman.
Yeah.
And so for me, I always tell my students, I'm like, no, you have the right to be angry. You have the right to put this in, but see in this political moment, how might your anger, which is correct, and you have the right to feel this, be turned against you to advance some kind of agenda that you don't know.
So can I ask you a very personal question?
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's any spiritual element in all of this that helped you to, transform into the older you that is able to, stand above that? And, would you feel comfortable telling me more about that?
Oh, no, I really do. And this is where, one, as a historian, but also a individual, because my mom's side of the family, historic AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, since the founding, like as free people of color in the 19th century. So I've had ministers in my family, deacons, even though I don't go to church regularly, I'm anti-big church, but it's a sense of knowing myself, but my own internal spirituality. So one of the things I usually do, I will sing spirituals, I'll sing songs to center myself and to think about and to control my reaction so I can get to a space where then I can be normal. But I find it's very also too, for me, that grounding and spiritual grounding helps me persist, helps me to go through that. I'm not, and how do you survive and work within an environment where they're surrounded by hate? You can either embrace that hate and be as hateful as what's coming in, or you can do something else in that transformative power. And that's where I really see my spiritual journey, and how I realize, I'm like, wait a minute, these individuals want me to do this. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give in to them. Instead, I'm going to draw on my inner strength and carry myself in a way to move forward, because I, like everyone else, have every right to be here. I deserve to be here. God put me here in this moment to do this. And that's the strength I continually draw upon. I also draw upon just the people who came before me. And as a historian, I see people who fought against slavery, those who fought in the Civil War, those who fought against the first Klan during Reconstruction, but yet still got married, had children, created communities, having that lives. And one of the things I always, I hear now, people like, oh, safe spaces and Snowflake. I'm like, no, those are spaces for healing, because you need to heal when you're constantly being bombarded. You need a space to regroup. And that individually, but that collective, and being able to surround yourself by people who help you regroup so you can persist and go another day and fight another fight. And I think that's where spirituality, history, but also being in the community with civil rights activists who are still alive.
Oh, man.
And you're just, and they're talking and listening to what they had to go through and overcoming the intergenerational decisions, because sometimes we might agree to disagree, but listen to, like, how did you persist? Where's that resilience, and where is that coming, and drawing on that and that perspective has this really helped me go forward, and also too helped me understand that everyone in the struggle for equality, just we're fighting for humanity and the recognition of humanity of all. That's the fight I will willing to fight.
Equality for all, but in this case, that means Black people first.
Yeah. Well, for me, I really look at, I always say, and people are like, oh, Black Lives Matter, that's exclusive. I'm like, no, Black political struggles have always been more inclusive in there. So I see someone say Black, I'm like, okay, you're talking about, if you fix here, you're fixing everyone.
Everything, yeah.
And so for me, so when I see Black as a movement, I already know they're signaling to a very traditional political thought that they mean all. Whereas when people say all lives matter, they really only mean just a few. But and that's that Black political struggle and tradition. And when you see like things under threat, like critical race theorists and intersectionality and stuff, they're really talking about Black inclusive politics. And that's just the word we use now. But people in the 19th century were advocating for everyone, from the marginalized of their community to uplift everyone. And they always started with the Black community that was under threat, but they were also willing to work beyond their community and finding those allies they needed. So those cross-racial, cross-class, cross-ethnicity has always been a part of the Black freedom struggle.
Yeah.
And which Black Lives Matter from its beginning, and even now in the summer, you really see they really mean cross-class, cross-racial, cross-ethnicity, cross-section in terms of sexuality, that we're fighting also for trans and LGBTQA plus people. They really mean that when they say Black. And that is, I think, the threat, and why there's this, oh, we're going to go down to the demonization because we're only saying Black without thinking about or understanding or caring to understand what that signals.
Yeah. So a little bit more about like the what is it called? Critical race theory?
Yes. So
I saw this post the other day of someone who was invited over to have a business talk about, and the main thing was that before she got there, they were like, well, can you please make sure that there's no like critical race theory involved?
Yeah, which is funny.
It's a new condition. It's like you can only come here and have a business talk if you do not include race theory.
No, it's about this is where that power in this administration to talk about and throw out these demon words that have been traditions for like over 100 years. Some sort of like, oh, so you center race and understandings of race over time, and political theories are that. They're theories. They're not actually what manifested. So for me, it's the idea of these words that talk about inclusivity, that you're going to talk about just not Black elites or white elites, but you're going to talk about Black working class individuals in rural America, and take an intersectional approach that there's a diversity of people and thought, because that's what you're asking, that there's not one monolithic. All of a sudden, that's a bad word. And so for me, I'm like, have you not seen academic thought and traditions in this country? Because this isn't new. This is something that you can date back to, and I'm thinking about C.R.L. James and others from like the late 60s, 70s. This is almost this long period of time.
So if you, because a lot of people are probably listening, it feels like it's just you and me, because I don't see anyone, it's just you. But can you like summarize what critical race theory is?
I always think it, because I am not a theorist. I will put that out there. I apply theory. I'm
apply theory.
apply theory to understand historical documents. I'm definitely a historian and an empiricist. I look at the materiality, but it's a way to think about the diversity of thought, the diversity of identity, to make sure you talk about race not just as a white monolithic presumed it fits everyone, but you also are paying attention to what we would say marginalized people, what their thoughts are, what their actions are, how the world shapes their understanding, their identity sense of politics, their sense of their movement and understanding them in the world. And so for me, some of the great political theorists James and Cone and others, and even Barbara Smith, who I would say who wrote was one of the people who wrote the Combahee River Statement. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of movement through the world, but also attuned to how one centers their worldview. Versus how I use it is I always use critical race theory, but also to just intersectionality, to look at the people that I'm understanding, that there's not just one way this happened. And this is something for me, I don't default history to great white men and great white women. Instead, I always look at the everyday person, regardless of their racial background and how they experience the world. And that means I have to look at them at their place. So if they're poor, if they're racialized in any form, their gender, their class, their education level, their place, all of that matters. So I can't just say monolithic, all African Americans. Instead, I'm going to qualify and say, no, Black women from this middle-class Black women are articulating this. And yes, working class women hated them for that because they put these class politics as if they needed to be uplifted, rather that they are their own agents of change. That type of analysis is all you're doing. And when I hear these, you can't talk about critical race theorists, then I'm like, so why do you have me in here? Because if you don't see me as a Black woman and someone who's equal, who wants to talk about my experience because you're not comfortable. So that's the signaling is that.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
You feel like you don't want me in here discussing a different worldview. That's basically what you're saying. So, and that's just a question I had, but and
it goes back to that willful ignorance. You don't want to see me as an agent of change, instead a stereotype, a caricature that's in your mind, rather than actually and believing that everyone who looks like me, just because of my race and my gender, I'm all the same. You're not interested in who I am as a person, and therefore I'm interchangeable. And every policy affects me the same as it does my cousins who don't have a PhD and everyone else. We are all interchangeable in this world. Right. It's only this few that have rights to be heard. So this is where the critical race theorist, but also what is American history? So for me, I'm waiting for, I can't teach the history of African Americans soon. That's what I'm looking for, because it's going to be anti-American. So if you take away the theorists, away. Oh, I see it coming.
That's going to happen?
I see, because if I say I'm centering Black people in my history, how am I getting funded? Because of this world order to say, oh, you can't have training. I'm like, that's fine. I don't train, but I'm a teacher. I'm an educator. So when is that?
You choose to center Black Americans in your class, that they feel like you're igniting the polarization. Is that what it is?
Yeah. And because I'm talking about also too, not a victimization narrative, but I'm also talking about the violence and how people responded to violence. And I'm talking about the actual lives of people and how they maneuvered political racial regimes. That's seen as threatening.
So you're tools as well, which is like you're not supposed to rise up to your potential. You're supposed to stay down. So that means you're definitely not helping. So but that means helping. And I think a lot of white people are thinking helping. Is this, you're talking about this like there's a war going on. And I remember having this discussion with, or mentioning this to Greg and Victor, and during our conversations. And I remember that Greg asked you, like, so do you feel like there's a war going on? And you were like, we're right in it.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
It's an ideological war. And when I think everyone thinks about war, and I hate the war metaphor, but it's so all over the place in the saying the war on drugs, the war on this crime. But ideologically, rhetoric wise, you can see it. I'm like, we've always had this ideological cultural war over, well, who gets the power to define, who has the power to define space, ideas, what gets taught in the classroom, what goes on the media, who gets published, who does it, and centering certain voices over others. That when you have something like what I'm thinking about the 1619 Project, where they're like, oh, wait, we're talking about that the American founders had more complex views on race. That's wrong because these were the American founders. I'm like, they were also slaveholders. That doesn't mean anything.
Get it twisted.
I'm not revealing anything that's new because I have their papers. And when you have the papers of the presidents and they list people by their first name and sales and bills of sales, I'm like, that's the same founding father too.
Yeah. So, but is that, again, there's education that comes to play, because the whitewashing has made it seem like the founding fathers were like heroes, and they were exactly no wrong. They were like, their morality was way up here. You're the founding father. So there's a misconception of what it means and what the identity is of those historical figures.
And so for me, as someone who's very much a historian, and I teach and I use documents, and financial documents are there, I'm like, I'm not revealing anything new because people have used these documents. What has changed is I'm asking a question about where are everyday people in this? How did Black women experience this trauma of this bill of sale? What did it mean that their children could be separated from them? And those types of questions, where right now we're seeing separation at the border, that now it's migrant Latino women. And I'm like, this is the same type of calculus and trauma of Black women early on, but also too that these families don't matter. These families only matter for certain political means and power. And so for me, studying the Black women experience of slavery allows me to understand more broadly this current political debate. That I'm like, do we need the same tools that Black women after the Civil War did, where they placed ads to try to find family members, where they're putting what they call information wanted ads and hoping for reunification? But that's threatening because I'm centering a Black woman who placed the ad in a newspaper, following her through the census records and the court records and getting their children back. But because I'm talking about that, shows that after the Civil War, everything wasn't great and slavery ended, but that didn't mean that trauma and that rebuilding was only Washington, D.C. I'm like, no, this was a mother trying to find her child in a structure that was not designed for her to do this, but yet she could. So why is that threatening by talking about that? Or why is it threatening to talk about the Confederate monuments coming down, where you have speeches praising the Anglo-Saxon race and that African Americans should be lynched? And my favorite from the University of North Carolina, where I got my PhD from, the speaker boasted of horse whipping a Negro wench. And I'm like, okay, Black woman went on a campus past this monument every day. All I could think about is the speaker who at the dedication would not even see my right to be here. But I'm like, no, I have every right to get my degree here, and I did. And when that came down, I walked by it with like, okay, I no longer have to see this anymore. but because I center and care about those individuals, how they did it, rather than the person and the values of the time promoting white supremacy, and my existence on that campus is only as labor to serve them, rather than to serve myself and having agency. And that, I think, when you start telling those histories and the messiness of history, that's why it's threatening. That's why you have these whitewash histories. And that's why we're starting to see policies that force us to go back to an American myth that never existed, from the founding fathers to the 20th century, because we actually have to talk about the experience of all Americans. And the violence perpetuated. And this is where Black Lives Matter, they always had that hashtag, but you see the Black Lives Matter syllabus, and you have all this other stuff. So they're putting in activism, education, because they see it as multi-pronged. Whitewash history, how do you deal with this? How do you get materials for people to learn about the past, to actualize it in the present? How do you organize? How do you talk to change law and policy? And all of that. And sometimes they're led by people who've been in the struggle for 10, 15, 20 plus years.
So thank you for all of this information. I'm like, I'm looking at the time. I don't know when we have to stop, but I have a couple more questions for you. If you just absorb everything you just said, and you have to really, really come to terms with, wait a minute, we are still living in a system, this white power structure. And no matter how much footage we see, no matter how much, how much knowledge we gain or like present, I just feel like, is this the time for Black people to start making a decision of creating their own infrastructures and like they have before? Like, is that one of the solutions? Like, while white people are trying to figure out and getting to the point like, oh, wait a minute, maybe, there is something wrong, even though my privilege gave me the luxury position to ignore it all this time. I feel like a lot of my friends, my friends, my creative colleagues are at a point where they're like, you know what, I'm gonna stop knocking at your door and trying to be seen, trying to be accepted, because everything points in the direction that at this point it's still impossible. So why not build our own structures?
One of the things is I always say is center yourself and your worth. If you know your worth and your dignity, you can build independent structures, but you can also coalition build with like-minded people. And one of the things that I find that's interesting is we need separate structures, because it's one thing I will not spend my money at a place that I know the politics of the place would not see me as a person. So therefore, I'm going to need alternate spaces, whether it's hotels, car rentals, because I'm changing the politics of my consumer power and how I shop. I also support those who are fighting and doing that work, but I've stopped buying certain things from certain products from people that their ethics do not align with me, and align in a way that's inclusive of all people. And all I'm asking is to see the humanity of everyone and treat everyone with dignity and respect. And that's very basic. It's very simple. But if you can't do that, I can't. So having one of the calls I've seen lately is, do we need a new green book for travel? And having a separate guide that African Americans during Jim Crow came up with, so they can travel with dignity and still shop and support businesses. So can we have a new green book, but also a new consumer guide of likewise global places that we can shift the power structure around, but also allow people to not feel that they can't live, because we can. It's getting those spaces and self-care.
I think here's like where the tech industry comes along, like a lot of new, innovators when it comes to technology, young Black men and women who are very much in the forefront of changing that in the technological era that we're living in right now. So one of the people that comes to mind, he comes to mind, but not necessarily his name.
Okay.
He worked with Nipsey Hussle a lot. He's one of the tech guys who was really, really into creating a digital space where, you know, Black people could really develop themselves. And I personally think that's amazing because it's all about money at the end of the day. So if we all shift our money, our financial means into Black infrastructures, that would definitely like force a shift. And not even, you know, there's always a white person that would ask me, and I get that question, like, but isn't that what we should not be doing, you know? Isn't that a way of polarizing communities?
No, it's already polarizing now when you go in and you're followed by spaces that your money doesn't matter, that green money, the dollar doesn't spend anywhere else. So one of the things I look at is self-determination and resiliency and community building for protection against self, but also to imagine a space that does not have to be the one that you're currently in. And for me, that community building, that coalition, and even in COVID, my good friend, Nishani Frazier and others built a COVID resource guide for people in the community of color who've been struggling, like, where do I go to a doctor? How do I know what questions to ask about COVID if I get sick? What are my next steps? That's the infrastructure that's separate. It's, again, expanding knowledge, expanding spaces, but expanding spaces that does not presume just because you're Black or brown and you have health disparities because of systemic racism, that you are deserving to die. And I've heard people say in this climate, oh, you're Black, you got sick, shame on you, you deserve to die, this is survival of the fittest. When you have that as your language, you need to go to somewhere else that's more healthy, more concerning, and more humanist. And that's where tech, that's where community building, but also people who refuse to give in to those spaces and like-minded allyship really matters.
I'm like, yes. I have one more. Oh, hi, Annette. I have one more question. Can I ask? I have a million more questions. I think we should have a conversation, just the two of us, and not with the pressure of like online viewers and all that stuff. But my last question would be like, I've been thinking lately about what activism looks like. And I think activism for Black people and white people is different, you know? There's a different type of urgency that is needed from white people at this point. Because I was looking back at our interview, and one of the things you said was people who remained on the sidelines will be complicit and will not look good. Those are fighting back in spite of all of what's happening are the ones who are going to be praised. And I know a lot of white people are definitely wondering, like, what do you want me to do? Like, I wasn't part of slavery. I wasn't a slave holder. Like, what do you want me to do in these times? What can they do? What does activism look like for white people?
Oh, no, this is an easy one. Even though they might not have been slaveholders, they benefited from a system where slavery existed through access to materials, banking, housing, and the like. So everyone has this issue to deal with. But one thing that they can do is renounce white supremacy. When you see people who are walking in the streets in their churches who say, you know what, everyone should be killed, they can speak up and say, no, they should not be. Let's have a different type of dialogue. So they can speak to the communities that they're comfortable with, but they can just speak up.
And even if that means in a boardroom where there's like, you know, a chairman who's like, okay, do we really have to talk about inclusivity again? And he starts rolling his eyes. And it takes a lot of courage, because I feel like a lot of people are not used to dealing with such an uncomfortable moment like that and having to make the choice like, no. That's not how you say that. That's not That's not acceptable.
And that is activism. That's the form of activism, speaking up when you see something that's not just. And that's something that everyone can do.
I agree. I agree so much. Thank you for all of your knowledge and just sharing this space with me and your time. I really appreciate you and all that you're doing back home. I think I will talk to you soon.
Mm-hmm.
I hope so.
For all the information, all the knowledge that you shared with us, I actually I will leave this conversation feeling that I would like to follow a course to have some more time and some assignments to dive deeper into this. And thank you also for the assignment that you gave us just now. Speak up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. And I think right now, this moment is historic, but everyone has a role. And just the one role everyone has is to educate, have empathy, and to speak up.
That's it.
Well, like Jutta said, we could talk for hours, and maybe we will, but for now, while we're live, we're gonna end this conversation. And for everybody who's been watching, thank you. And next Sunday, same time, same place, online, we'll have another conversation in Dutch with Laila Frank, who's a journalist and also a campaign specialist. And we're going to look into the background of the historical elections coming up with her. So for everyone who's interested, we hope to see you next Sunday. And for now, again, thank you, Hillary. And also thank you, Jutta, for having this conversation with Hillary. It was really interesting.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
Good. Well, bye to everyone who was listening.
Bye. Thank you so much.